There is a version of this story that plays out in millions of households every single month, and it goes something like this. A person earns a reasonable income, pays their bills on time, avoids obvious financial disasters, and still, after years of working, finds themselves with almost nothing saved, no clear sense of forward momentum, and a quiet, persistent feeling that they must be doing something wrong, even if they can't quite name what it is. They are not reckless. They are not irresponsible. They simply learn to save money the way most people learn to save money, by putting whatever is left over at the end of the month into a separate account and hoping it adds up. And that method, as logical as it sounds on the surface, is one of the most quietly destructive financial habits that modern behavioral economics has ever documented. This video is not about motivation. It is not about cutting lattes or waking up at 5 in the morning or adopting the mindset of a millionaire. It is about something far more specific and far more useful: the structural mechanics of why the most common approach to saving money is mathematically and psychologically designed to fail, and what the data actually reveals about how people who successfully build wealth over time approach the same problem differently. To understand why the conventional method breaks down, you first have to understand what it is actually asking the human brain to do. When someone earns a paycheck and pays their expenses first, rent, groceries, utilities, subscriptions, dining, entertainment, and then attempts to save whatever remains, they are essentially asking their brain to perform an act of sustained restraint across dozens of small decisions spread over 30 days, with no fixed boundary, no clear stopping point, and no structural mechanism to prevent the remainder from gradually shrinking towards zero. And the brain, operating on the same basic architecture it has always operated on, is not particularly well suited for that kind of sustained, open-ended friction. It prefers clarity over ambiguity, immediate reward over deferred gratification, and familiar patterns over new ones. And the spend first, save the rest model exploits every single one of those tendencies in the wrong direction. Behavioral economists call the underlying phenomenon present bias, and it has been studied extensively across decades of research in both laboratory settings and real-world financial behavior. The core finding is consistent. When people are asked to choose between a smaller reward now and a larger reward later, the vast majority will discount the future reward far more steeply than any rational calculation would justify. This is not a character flaw. It is not evidence of weakness or poor values. It is a deeply embedded feature of how the human brain processes time and uncertainty, and it is almost perfectly calibrated to undermine any saving strategy that depends on willpower applied repeatedly over long stretches of time. Every day that passes between a paycheck and the end of the month is another opportunity for present bias to quietly redirect money away from savings and towards something that feels more immediate, more certain, and more real. The mathematician in the room would point out that this is not merely a psychological problem, it is also a compounding one. Every dollar that does not get saved is not simply a dollar lost in the moment. It is a dollar that will not grow, will not compound, and will not be there a decade or 2 decades from now when it could have been worth multiples of its original value. The Federal Reserve's Survey of Consumer Finances, conducted every 3 years, consistently shows that the median American household holds remarkably little in liquid savings relative to income, and the gap between what people intend to save and what they actually save, a figure that researchers have come to call the savings intention gap, tends to widen rather than narrow over time, precisely because the spend-first structure ensures that competing demands on money always have first access. Consider what this looks like mathematically across a 10-year period. A person earning $50,000 annually who saves 10% of their income, $5,000 per year, and invests it consistently in a broadly diversified portfolio with a historically reasonable average annual return would accumulate a meaningfully different outcome than a person with the same income who intends to save 10% but consistently saves 4 or 5%, because their spending expands to absorb the remainder. The difference in final accumulated wealth after 10 years, factoring in compound growth, is not modest. It is often the difference between having a financial foundation and not having one. And yet, the two people in this scenario may feel almost identical in their day-to-day experience because neither one is making dramatically obvious financial errors. The only difference is structural, not behavioral. This is where the research on automatic saving becomes genuinely striking. The landmark studies behind what eventually became the Save More Tomorrow program, developed by behavioral economists Shlomo Benartzi and Richard Thaler, demonstrated that when saving is made automatic, when the money is removed from the paycheck before the individual ever sees it or has the opportunity to make a decision about it, savings rates increase dramatically, often doubling or tripling over a period of a few years without participants reporting any meaningful reduction in their sense of financial well-being or lifestyle satisfaction. The reason this works so reliably is not because automation changes the math, but because it changes the architecture of the decision. Instead of asking the brain to resist spending every single month, it removes the spending option entirely for that portion of income, and the brain adapts to the new baseline as though it were always the reality. This principle, sometimes called paying yourself first, though that phrase has become so overused that it tends to get dismissed as generic advice, is not a motivational slogan when you understand the mechanism behind it. It is a structural intervention in the decision environment, and the evidence supporting it is not anecdotal. It spans decades of research, natural experiments in corporate retirement plan design, and cross-cultural studies of saving behavior in countries with different default structures for pension contributions. The countries and systems where saving is the default, where you must actively opt out rather than opt in, consistently produce higher savings rates at every income level, not because the people in those systems are more disciplined or more financially sophisticated, but because the structure removes the friction from the desired behavior and places it instead on the undesired one. The systemic dimension of this problem runs deeper than individual psychology. The entire architecture of consumer spending in modern economies is engineered at considerable expense and sophistication to work in the opposite direction. Marketing research has spent decades refining techniques for reducing the psychological friction associated with spending, one-click purchasing, buy now, pay later schemes, subscription services that bill automatically, reward programs that reframe spending as a form of earning, while no equivalent infrastructure has been built to make saving feel equally immediate, equally rewarding, or equally effortless. The result is an environment in which every dollar of income faces a highly optimized pull toward consumption and an almost entirely unoptimized pull toward accumulation, and individuals are expected to overcome that asymmetry through personal discipline applied indefinitely over time. The data suggests, without ambiguity, that most people cannot and do not sustain that level of friction-dependent behavior across long time horizons. And this is not a moral failure, it is a predictable outcome of placing an individual psychology against a system specifically calibrated to defeat it. Understanding this dynamic shifts the entire frame of what it means to save money well. It is not primarily a question of values, and it is not primarily a question of income. Studies consistently show that savings rates do not automatically rise in proportion to income increases because lifestyle inflation tends to absorb a significant portion of any raise before the raise has even had time to register as meaningful. It is a question of structure, sequencing, and friction placement. People who successfully build savings over time are not, in most cases, people with exceptional willpower or dramatically higher incomes. They are, more often than not, people who have, whether deliberately or by circumstance, arranged their financial system so that saving happens before spending is possible, so that the default state of their money is accumulation rather than availability, and so that the psychological friction sits on the side of spending rather than saving. The identity shift that tends to accompany this structural change is worth examining carefully, because it is often what sustains the behavior over the long term in a way that motivation alone never quite manages to. When a person moves from thinking of themselves as someone who is trying to save more to someone who simply has a fixed, non negotiable allocation of income that moves into savings automatically on payday, the same way rent is non negotiable, the same way taxes are non negotiable, the cognitive relationship with money begins to change in subtle but durable ways. The savings number stops feeling like a sacrifice and starts feeling like a fact of their financial landscape, and their spending decisions begin to organize themselves around what remains rather than around the full paycheck. This is not a philosophical transformation. It is a structural one that happens to produce philosophical effects. None of this is to suggest that the mechanics of where money is saved and how it is invested are unimportant. They are genuinely significant, and the difference between money sitting in a low yield account versus being deployed in a broadly diversified, low cost portfolio compounds substantially over time. But those questions are downstream of the more fundamental structural question of whether the money is being saved consistently in the first place. And the data is fairly clear that inconsistent saving in an optimal vehicle produces worse outcomes than consistent saving in a merely adequate one. The sequence matters. The architecture matters. The default matters. What the research ultimately reveals is something both simpler and more uncomfortable than most financial advice tends to acknowledge. The problem is not that people don't know they should save, and it is not that they lack the desire to do so. The problem is that the most common method of saving, earn, spend, save the rest, is structurally misaligned with how human decision-making actually functions under real conditions across real time in a real consumer environment. And the solution is not to become a better decision maker in that misaligned structure. The solution is to change the structure itself so that the right outcome happens by default rather than by effort. The people who understand this, not in theory, but in the actual design of their financial lives, are not necessarily wealthier to begin with, and they are not necessarily more disciplined. They have simply stopped fighting the current and started redirecting it. And over time, the mathematics of compounding does the rest of the work quietly and without drama in the background of an ordinary life.